Hey guys, today we are going to continue our talk about World War II. We are just talking about the beginnings of it right now, how it got started and what's happening in some of those countries. So far, remember, the U.S. is back into a place where they want to remain isolated. They're practicing isolationism, minding their own business. In Italy, we talked about the rise of fascism. Fascism being a form of government that relies heavily on militarism and violence to achieve their goals. This particular dictator, Benito Mussolini, his goal was to revive the ancient Roman Empire. Okay, so he took freedoms from the people. The main goal for fascism is the focus on the country and what is best for the country, not necessarily what is best for the people. Okay, now fascism started spreading Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Japan. It also appealed to a German general from World War I named Adolf Hitler. He kind of took that and ran with it and practiced his own kind of form of fascism. It was a little bit different. Adolf Hitler named himself the Führer, meaning the leader. He believed that there was one master Aryan race and that it was better than all the other races. He believed that the other races should be exterminated, gotten rid of. He sought to create a master German empire that would last over 1,000 years, called the Third Reich. He also was very bitter about the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. He felt that Germany was treated unfairly, and he wanted revenge. Okay, so here we are about 21 years later, where we left off yesterday. About 21 years after the Great War, the First World War. And when we left off yesterday, Britain and France had had enough of Germany and Adolf Hitler's nonsense. They were kind of taking over. They took over Rhineland, which was the no man's land. It was the forbidden area from the Treaty of Versailles that would act as a buffer between Germany and France. They took that over. France and Britain turned the other cheek because they have enough going on with their own depression in their economy, just like the one going on in the United States. So Germany takes over Poland, and Germany takes over Austria. And Germany, remember, was kind of going for Russia because they didn't get along with Russia because Russia practiced communism. Communism is a type of social system or government system that is organized in a way that all property is owned by the community or owned by the government. So usually communism also has a dictator, similar to fascism, and they seek to achieve a classless society. So basically, everybody works and contributes, and everybody receives fairly. So if you are, no matter what job you have, you might have the same as everybody else. Whereas in America, in our democracy, if you want lots of things and you want nice, expensive things, you want to find a job that pays you more money. And that didn't really matter with communism. So communism, well, I'm just going to read this part. Communism and fascism, they're both considered extremes. In theory, fascism and communism hold deeply opposing political philosophies. But historically, both fascists and communists have established extremist governments that are more alike than they are different. Communists emphasize state control of property and industry rather than private ownership, with the supposed goal of achieving a classless society in which all people are treated equally. Fascists allow private ownership of property and glorify the nation above all individual interests. Both communist and fascist states tend to be ruled by dictators who use extreme measures to maintain political control, deny freedoms of speech and the press, and employ harsh reprisals against those who oppose them. And in this case for communism in Russia, which after the Bolshevik Revolution became the USSR, Joseph Stalin was our dictator. So we've got Stalin, we've got Mussolini, and we've got Hitler. Okay, so here's our map as we left it yesterday. Our allies are over here in green, Great Britain and France. And then we've got our axis. Our axis was Italy with Germany and Japan, who is not on the map, so I put it over here to the side. Japan had kind of its own similar goals. Remember, we know that Japan was kind of following along in that fascism movement, and they kind of jumped on board because they wanted some of the same things that Germany and Italy wanted, so they decided to work together and become the Axis powers. All right, so now we're going to read and find out how Joseph Stalin gets involved in all this. Remember, Russia was one of the allies during World War I. They were on a side with Great Britain and France and the United States. So what do you think is going to happen for World War II? Do you think they are going to remain allies, or do you think that they might join the Axis powers? Let's find out. By 1928, through brutal and treacherous means, Joseph Stalin had established himself as the Soviet Union's dictator. Stalin was driven by one goal: to make communism victorious in Russia and elsewhere. The first step, as he saw it, was to transform the Soviet Union, still devastated from World War I, into an industrial power. Stalin faced a choice. He could concentrate the hungry people's energies either on building factories or on growing food. So they're devastated. They're in their own depression too. There's not enough food. And so Stalin's thinking, should I make the people work on growing food for us, or should I make the people work on building factories? He chose the factories. He decided his people must starve if necessary. So to him, it was more important to have these industries and factories to gain power around the world than to feed the people. Beginning in 1929, Stalin's troops herded 20 million peasants into cities to work in factories. The rest were ordered onto huge collective farms that covered thousands of acres. Many peasants who owned their own land and livestock resisted this drastic plan. Stalin forced them to obey. Those who rebelled against collectivization were marched to Siberia. It has been estimated that perhaps 15 million people were thus deported, and that about 3 million, mostly children, died along the way. The survivors ended up in brutal prison camps where many more died. Millions of peasants became, in effect, slaves of the Soviet Union's collective farms. Across the huge country, Stalin's Communist Party told farmers and factory workers exactly what it expected them to produce. By the 1930s, Stalin's brutal plan to turn the Soviet Union into a worker state seemed to be succeeding. The Soviet Union was becoming an industrial powerhouse, producing steel, cars, tractors, and military goods. Stalin held sway as a totalitarian ruler, a dictator exercising complete control over the state and the lives of its people, with a feared legion of secret police to enforce his will. When Hitler began grabbing European lands, British and French officials hoped that Stalin would join them in opposing the Führer. After all, Russia, that is the Soviet Union, had been the ally of Britain and France in World War I. But in August 1939, Europe was shocked when Stalin signed a treaty with Hitler. In this treaty, often called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the Nazis and communists set aside their mutual loathing or their dislike for each other and agreed not to go to war with each other. They also secretly agreed to divide Poland amongst them. So, I'm not going to color Russia yet because they haven't joined the war. They have agreed to not go to war with each other. So, this might get a little bit complicated. If Russia can't fight Germany, will Russia stay neutral? Or will they have to join the Axis powers and fight against Great Britain? And here's Poland. Germany's already taken Poland. They decide to divide it amongst each other. I'm not sure how that division looks just yet. Okay. So, we've got a war going on in Europe. It's 1939. And, I wonder, how did we get involved in all this? Aren't we minding our own business? It's kind of a mess over there in Europe. I'm thinking some people probably wanted to step in. Some people probably didn't. Let's find out what happens. As brutal fascist regimes rose to power in Europe, the United States, preoccupied with its own crisis, remained aloof and disengaged. What does that mean? That means we were still trying to climb out of the Great Depression, so we didn't participate in any of this. We minded our own business, we had our own stuff to deal with, and we stayed out of it. Or tried to. As the Great Depression took hold, American isolationism only deepened. Pennsylvania Governor George Earle spoke for many of his countrymen when he said in 1935, "If the world is to become a wilderness of waste, hatred, and bitterness, let us all the more earnestly protect and preserve our own oasis of liberty." So he's basically saying, if they're all going to act like crazy fools, then let's do everything we can to keep what peace we have peaceful. Congress passed 5 neutrality acts between 1935 and 1939. Neutrality means acts and laws that we will not get involved in this war. As the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt likened his European policy to a quarantine in which the diseased patients would be confined and prevented from spreading their illness to the American continent. That is an excellent comparison for what we're going through right now. And we even have travel bans and everything. So he was not talking about an actual illness though. So right now we have an actual illness, a virus, that we are having to stay away from each other so we can make sure it's not spreading more than it's going to. But Franklin Roosevelt, that's an excellent metaphor. He made a metaphor comparing this war to a quarantine. So he's basically telling Americans that we need to quarantine ourselves to our country so that the disease of war will not affect us. So we're still not involved. In the summer of 1939, German panzer divisions invaded the Polish countryside. while Hitler's bombers battered the city of Warsaw, which is in Poland. If you've been listening to Letters from Rivka, you'll know that Rivka spent some time in Warsaw, Poland. The news of Hitler's brazen assault reached FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He responded with a sense of foreboding. He said, "God help us all." The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. The German army overran Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, largely due to Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy, which combined lightning speed and overwhelming firepower. Faced with weak resistance, German forces seized control of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. France fell next, leading British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to lament, "The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." On July 10, 1940, Hitler's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, initiated a series of bombing raids against Britain's coastal defenses. 2 months later, Hitler's planes began to strike at Britain's heart, raining bombs on London's civilian population in what became known as the Blitz. Tens of thousands of British civilians died. Now, when I say civilian population, that means regular people in their homes, okay? So these are not soldiers. We all know that when armies go to war or troops go to battle, that people are going to be killed or injured on each side. And people who choose to be in the armed forces know that's a possibility when they join. But kind of the rules of warfare, you're supposed to keep it to the battlefield. So you're kind of crossing a line when you start to mess with regular people from either country. Okay, so that's what Hitler started to do with his blitzkrieg, his lightning-fast firepower, and he started to bomb London. And it wasn't just on the battlefield. He was bombing London's regular civilians.